Please make yourself at home here, get snacks, whatever you like. We're really delighted you've joined us. My name is Peggy Clark. I'm Vice President of Policy Programs here at the Institute, and I run Aspen Global Health and Development, which is one of our programs. This is our 7 billion and counting series. Those of you may remember, it was actually Halloween Day 2011 when the world's population hit 7 billion. We began a series that year and continued it through the following year, really looking at the question of population as it relates to other sectors: environment, food security, water, national security. And so I'm really delighted to see that we have a number of people from a whole array of sectors in the room, including environment, including food security, including health. That's the objective behind these conversations, and so we welcome you to us today. I'd like to really thank, we have an amazing set of donors that support this series at Aspen. USAID, our dear colleague Liz is here with us today. Thank you, Liz, for joining us. Packard Foundation, Hewlett Foundation, and the United Nations Foundation have joined us in tackling this question of population. So I'd like to begin by welcoming my panel. We have an extraordinary panel. We started talking in the green room before the meeting. We could have gone on for a few hours just there. Between these guys, they are deeply engaged in these issues. To my immediate left, I'm delighted to welcome Stephen Feldstein, who's here. Stephen is the Director of the Office of Policy in the Bureau for Policy Planning and Learning at the U.S. Agency for International Development. He particularly is responsible for strategic thinking and developing agency-wide policies. He is very engaged under Administrator Raj Shah's USAID's leadership in the global community on some of these issues. Previously, he was on the Hill. He was counsel on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee with Chairman Biden and Kerry, where he oversaw a portfolio that included oversight on all U.S. foreign assistance agencies' budgets and programs. So he's actually quite well suited to this broad-ranging conversation here today. He also worked at the U.S. Department of State as a special assistant for the Undersecretary for Economics. He's an adjunct professor at AU's School of International Service, which is terrific. He spent time working for the International Rescue Committee in Rwanda and Croatia. He received his law degree from Berkeley School of Law and his AB from Princeton University. And he's from Indiana, which is great. So we're delighted to have you with us today. Thank you. Thanks for joining us. And to his left, we have Shantayam Devarajan. Shanta is what everyone's called you, which is easier. We're delighted to have you, Shanta, with us. You're the chief economist of the World Bank's Africa region. Since joining the World Bank in 1991, he's been a principal economist and research manager for public economics in the Development Research Group, and chief economist of the Human Development Network, which is a huge initiative of the World Bank, and of the South Africa region. He was the director of the World Development Report 2004, Making Services Work for Poor People. I don't know if any of you saw that. It was really quite a seminal piece of work. Before 1991, he was on the faculty of Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. He's the author of over 100 publications. His research covers public economics, trade policy, natural resources, and the environment, also making him perfect for this conversation today. Shanta received his BA in mathematics from Princeton. We have some alumni group here, and his PhD in economics from the University of California, Berkeley. So welcome, Shanta. We're delighted to have you with us. And to Shanta's left, we have Elia Zulu, who is a dear friend. He was with us talking about this subject at the Earth Summit in Rio, at a USAID-sponsored event, which was terrific. Elia is the executive director of the African Institute for Development Policy, which is known as AFIDEP. Many people have heard about AFIDEP's work. It's a very well-respected organization. Before that, he was the deputy director and director of research in the African Population and Health Research Center, where he headed the Policy Engagement and Communications Unit and the Urbanization and Wellbeing Research Program. Dr. Zulu has over 20 years' experience in developing and managing research, capacity building, and policy engagement programs. He has most recently been very deeply involved in this demographic dividend issue. In fact, he has been probably in more countries than Hillary Clinton went to Secretary of State, I'm not sure. But he has been traveling the world talking about this issue. He is a really thoughtful voice, and so we are really delighted you adjusted your travels to be with us here today. We know that was not often easy to do. Dr. Zulu is the ex-president of the Union for African Population Studies. He was a member of the UK Royal Society study group that produced a seminal report, People on the Planet. He served on a number of WHO expert panels, including the expert panel examining research on the link between contraceptives and HIV infection. Dr. Zulu earned his PhD in demography at the University of Pennsylvania. It was close to Princeton, but not quite there. We would have had an alumni panel here. He has a master's in population and development of the Australian National University and a Bachelor of Social Science in Economics and Applied Statistics at the University of Malawi. So that's wonderful. So I'm delighted to welcome our panel. Thank you so much for being with us today. Some of you in the room may know what we mean when we say demographic dividend. For others of you, it's a theoretical concept that's sort of hard to put your hands around. And so our colleagues at Population Reference Bureau have done a series of policy briefs and presentations on what the demographic dividend is. So I'm delighted that we have a colleague from PRB here today who will open this conversation with a very short, it's just a 7-minute presentation on what is the demographic dividend. And we're really delighted to welcome you here. Marissa, if you would like to just introduce yourself and then begin our slideshow.
Thank you, Peggy. My name is Marissa Yaki, and I'm from the Population Reference Bureau. And
wonder if we, yeah, can everyone see that okay? Perfect, great.
So we're gathered here today because policymakers and researchers around the world are talking excitedly about the demographic dividend and harnessing the demographic dividend for economic growth in their nations. With so much positive development underway, such as increases in education, improvements in health, and reduced poverty, many people believe that accelerated economic gains are right around the corner. But with almost 2 out of 3 Africans still living on less than $2 per day, much remains to be done. The demographic dividend is the accelerated economic growth that can happen as the population age structure changes, together with strategic investments in health, education, economic policy, and governance. But by no means is the demographic dividend automatic. The starting point is the population structure and how many dependent children there are in relation to the older, working age population. As the number of births each year declines, the young dependent population grows smaller in relation to the working age population. With more workers and fewer young people to support, a country has a window of opportunity for accelerated economic growth, known as the demographic dividend. So let's take a closer look at changing population structure in 2 countries. Thailand, and then we'll take a look at Rwanda. And we're going to start with Thailand's population pyramid in 1960. Each layer of this diagram is an age group, and the width of each layer represents the proportion of the population in that age group. It looks like a pyramid because when couples have many children, more people are added each year in the younger age groups at the base of the pyramid. In 1960, more than 40% of Thailand's population was under the age of 15, and women had an average of 6 children each. During the 1960s and the decades that followed, mortality rates declined. Desire for smaller families increased, and investments in family planning enabled rapid declines in fertility. By the 1990s, women were having an average of 2 children each, and as a result, population growth slowed. By 2010, Thailand's population was larger, and the age structure was transformed, with a smaller population of young people. This change in the age structure helped accelerate economic growth. Today, Thailand's population is dominated by working age adults who will be part of a productive labor force for many years. Let's turn now to Rwanda, a country that has made great progress over the last decade in improving health, lowering fertility, and increasing economic growth. Like much of Africa today, Rwanda's age structure is young, with 40% of the population under the age of 15 and an average of 4 to 5 children per woman. Even with Rwanda's progress, the age structure will stay young for several decades. In 2030, if fertility continues to decline to close to 3 children per woman, 35% of Rwanda's population will be under the age of 15, a higher percentage than in any country, including Thailand, that has realized a demographic dividend. In Rwanda and in many African countries that have not made similar progress, getting from here to here requires 3 key investments. First, improve child survival. In many African countries, more than 1 of every 10 children dies before they turn 5. Improving child health services allows more children to survive and leads to couples desiring smaller families. Second, space births and prevent unintended pregnancies. Currently, more than 50% of African women who don't want to become pregnant are not using a modern method of contraception. Increased investments in family planning will prevent unintended pregnancies, leading to fewer births per woman. And third, educate girls. Throughout Africa, only 1 out of 3 girls of secondary school age is enrolled in school. But when girls stay in school, particularly through secondary level, they are more likely to delay early marriage and childbearing and have healthier families. Together, these investments lead to lower fertility and mortality and enable panelists here today. It starts with a change in the population age structure, which hinges on lowering fertility and equitable access to voluntary family planning. Investments in health services and education foster a healthy, productive, and skilled workforce. Economic policies foster job growth, trade, and foreign investment, while good governance builds civic participation and confidence in the government and social institutions. No single sector is able to transfer the momentum of the age structure transformation into the economic growth of a dividend. Rather, all of the gears must work together. As each component fits into place, the gears begin to turn and engage, pushing nations forward to the promise of accelerated development and prosperity by harnessing a demographic dividend. Thank you.
Thank you, Marissa. I appreciate that very much, and we'll certainly turn to you if any other questions come up. Let me just begin by asking you, Steve, the title of this conversation today is The Demographic Dividend. It's not for demographers anymore. Do you think that's true, and why?
Yeah, no, I think that's it's a great way to think about it, and it's a way we're trying to I think transition and change our thinking at USAID when it comes to this issue, when it comes to how we're approaching it going forward. I mean, I think, you know, for a long period of time, this is something that many people looked upon either as belonging to a specific group or something that really related to a certain set of inputs, and as we can see here, you know, a large part of that I think really related to sort of family planning. Whether it's maternal mortality, child mortality, linking to education a little bit. I think what we're trying to do is think about it more cross-sectorally, and that it is something that extends just beyond one particular avenue or one particular set of interventions. I think one of the interesting things is really looking at the sort of the spectrum across several different generations, in fact, that it's not just even looking at a generation that kind of then reaches productive working age and all of a sudden is finding itself lacking in opportunities, economic opportunities, and so forth. It's also thinking beyond that in terms of governance, in terms of a second demographic dividend when it comes to older age populations, and thinking about that more as a whole. And I think, you know, within USAID, often we approach things from a sector-specific perspective. We have a global health bureau, we have food security interventions, and so on. And this is, I think, a great platform in which to think about those more holistically. How do they intersect? How do they work together? How can policymakers think about trade-offs between one another and understand the trends that will underlie their societies going forward?
Right, great. Thanks, Steve. So, Shanta, let me turn to you for a minute. When we use the term demographic dividend, most people think of the Asian tigers and the experiences we saw in countries like South Korea, Singapore, Thailand that had dramatic reductions in family size, but also incredible increases. And I think in the 1960s, no one would have expected that Thailand would become a modern economic state that is now. So, why is demographic dividend relevant to the countries you work in, Africa, for example?
Well, it's precisely because of the success of the demographic dividend in Asia. It tells us that the demographic dividend in Africa represents an unprecedented opportunity, because the demographics in Africa are such that there will be a youth bulge. There will be a huge increase in the number of young people. If the fertility decline that has been observed in some parts of Africa can be translated to the rest of the continent, we will see a drop in the dependency ratio, the kind that was referred to earlier in terms of East Asia. And if we can take advantage of this drop in the dependency ratio, which will generate higher labor supply, higher growth, savings, and employment, this would be the once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for Africa, an unprecedented historic opportunity for Africa to take off into sustained economic growth. Let me add that this is not just Africa we're talking about, because this is also a once-in-a-species opportunity, because Africa will be the only place where there are young people. The rest of the world, as we saw with the Thailand example, is aging. So this could be the workbench of the world, if we can harness it and do the right things as you've had before. So I don't think we've ever had this opportunity for the kind of sustained growth that Africa is capable of.
So for example, I know that Dr. Zulu and some of the senior state and USAID colleagues were just 2 weeks ago in Ivory Coast for an African Union Economic Commission of Africa meeting, where demographic dividend was raised really to the highest level, and it appeared in the outcome document, and there was a specific resolution on it. Can you tell us a little bit about what was discussed there? And I think I have some of the language on the resolution, which is quite interesting. 43 ministers of finance in Africa said, "We note the importance for Africa to introduce immediate measures to capitalize on its demographic dividend through increased and sustained investments in health and education, particularly for women, the girl child." Tell us a little bit about those conversations, and if you believe that this is more than a question for demographers today.
Yeah, actually, on that question on whether it's for everybody, not only demographers, I would say that given that the term demographic dividend was actually coined by economists, the issue should be that it's not just for economists anymore. It's for everybody, because actually I think the concept of the demographic dividend has mostly relied on the economy side of the equation. But getting back to your issue about what's happening in Africa, I think this is really a very, very bright moment for Africa. Or you can say that Africa is on the verge. There have been all these development shackles that we've been grappling with for decades. But there's a new crop of African leaders now who are really seeking to break from the past, to really chart a different development course for the continent. And yeah, there are pockets around the continent where there's still bad governance and that sort of thing. But I think the continent is moving forward. And going to all these meetings, like the meeting that was there last week with the ministers of finance, it was very, very encouraging to see the ministers actually embrace this concept. The ministers of finance, the leaders in Africa, are looking at the sort of statistics we are seeing here. What Asian tigers were like in the 60s. If you look at the Uganda development plan, the Kenya development plan, there's a reference there to the fact that these countries were similar to where Thailand, Indonesia, and so on were in the 1960s. Now what happened? Why is Africa still behind when these other countries have gone forward? So the analysis that came up to show that the demographic dividend could have contributed up to a third of the change that happened in these countries is very, very appealing to African leaders. And so the meeting that was done last week was actually convened by the African Union Commission, jointly with the Economic Commission for Africa. And I'm a member of the steering committee that the African Union is leading to basically promote the concept of the demographic dividend across Africa. In July this year, I spoke at a joint meeting of ministers of finance and health in Tunisia, where we brought up this issue for the first time. And that also ended up in the resolutions that were made there. And then we're all leading to this meeting last week, where, as Peggy said, this concept was also endorsed as a valuable platform for African countries to adopt in addressing a lot of the development challenges. So it's very, very encouraging that the ministers of finance, who are basically the guys who write the checks, we've been targeting them specifically, but they are not the only group. The African Union Steering Committee has made presentations to ministers of youth, to ministers of health, as I said, and to many other groups. I spoke to MPs, parliamentary committees for health from 21 African countries in September to talk about the same issue. But we are targeting the ministers of finance because once the ministers of finance endorse an issue, it's likely that the issue will be prioritized. And ultimately, the aim is to try to get the summit, the heads of state at African Union level, also to endorse this paradigm.
So what would a Minister of Finance do, for example, in a country like Tanzania or Uganda or Malawi? We talk here about the different, the wheels. And I remember just recently, you said the Minister of Finance of Thailand presented about this, and he very much articulated what happened in the 1960s and the investments in family planning, the investments in education, numeracy, but also interestingly talked about on the economic development front, an industrialization plan, and that led to investments in textiles and garment manufacturing. So let me ask all of you to talk a little bit about what you would recommend. I mean, what is this urgency that I'm hearing from all of you lead to in terms of specific policy recommendations that you would say to your colleagues? Let me just start with you, Dr. Zulu, and move to Shanta.
I think the reason why we are targeting the Minister of Finance, as I said, they write the checks, but also they set the tone for what are the priorities in a given country. So, and the critical point to note, really, as we speak about this, is that the demographic dividend is actually a bonus. It shouldn't be seen as a replacement for development or be seen as a new sort of development paradigm. Many of us have been criticized by people in other quarters that we seem to be overzealous sometimes and talk like, finally we have the solution to Africa's underdevelopment. I mean, the demographic dividend is a bonus. It's about encouraging countries that if you enhance investments in education, in health, in improve governance, adopt economic policies that will create jobs, create an environment for enhancing investments and so on. If you do that, that on its own would result to development, would address the poverty and so on. But once you do that, and at the same time facilitate fertility decline and mortality decline, we should also emphasize, then you are going to have this bonus. You're going to have this surplus labor force. That if all the other things are done with that labor force, then it can push you forward. So I think once the ministers of finance understand that, they will then make the appropriate investments that need to be made in education, in health, in these other sectors that don't receive that much attention in the budgets in our countries.
Yeah, Shanta, let me ask you your thoughts about that. Do you agree with what Dr. Zulu is saying? And I think to play devil's advocate, this is a really big reach for a lot of the countries that we're targeting right now. What are your thoughts about it?
I would say I agree with 50%, and I'll tell you why. I mean, fundamentally, we agree. I think the things you need to do to harness the demographic dividend are mostly things you need to do to get development going. Girls' education, water, sanitation, employment, trade, growth, all the wonderful things laid out there. So it's absolutely fundamental development that's going to deliver the demographic dividend. The one qualification I would say is, you refer to the finance ministers as the guys who write the checks. Checks are not going to solve the problem. And we have to be very careful about that just because they spend more money on education, even more money on girls' education, doesn't necessarily get more girls into school. Or worse than that, doesn't get the girls who are in school to learn. There are profound governance problems in education and health and transport and water that are standing in the way of these investments actually delivering development outcomes. And that's a much harder problem because it's a political problem. You've got very powerful teachers' unions you know, in a country like Uganda, teachers are absent 25% of the time. So it's not surprising. And by the way, when they're in school, they're in class teaching about 20% of the time. And don't ask me what they're up to for the rest. Right? And in that kind of situation, increasing spending on education is just paying these teachers to be absent more often. We have to be very careful about that. But try getting education reform in Uganda, or in Kenya for that matter. I know you live in Kenya. Yeah. You know, try to get a system of contract teachers introduced, and the teachers' unions are out there protesting right away.
At the same time, you very optimistically started by saying this is a once-in-a-species opportunity.
Absolutely.
So let me take you back to that optimistic place to hear how really.
Okay, I'll tell you why I'm optimistic. That's why I come back to be agreeing with you.
Okay, we hear why you're pessimistic.
No, because of exactly, I think you alluded to this, that we've had now 10 to 15 years of unprecedented overall economic growth in Africa. Right. The average growth rate since 2000 has been about 5%, a little under 5%. In fact, if you take out South Africa, it's 6%. Africa today is the fastest growing, Africa minus South Africa, is the fastest growing region in the world. Right? And 7 of the 10 fastest growing countries are in sub-Saharan Africa. And this is not an accident. And it's not just resource prices. We have resource-poor countries that are growing at 7, 8, 9%. And fundamentally, it's because macroeconomic policies have improved over this decade. The average inflation rate in the 2000s was half of what it was in the 1990s. Right? There's been a tremendous shift. Now, if they were able to overcome that, and that was because of this new generation of leaders, the policymakers, who actually were able to overcome the political obstacles to macroeconomic policy reform. They did it, and it worked. So my conjecture is that if they were able to do that on the macro front, they should be able to do it on the micro front.
Good, yeah. Let me,
I think, can I just, maybe a
please.
quick point on this? I think your point about, that development is what really needs to be done. I think the point I made, we're not just trying to target ministers of finance. We understand that it's not just the check, but the check is important, as you know. I think I mentioned that we're also targeting other audiences. We've talked to ministers of youth, education, and the reason why we want to take it to the summit level is that you need that overall political leadership. Governance is a critical issue. So, but you can't do it at once. I think you need to do it at stages. By targeting the ministers of finance, it increases the chances that this issue can actually be adopted at the summit level. Right. And if it's adopted at summit level, then you start creating that top-level leadership that will start addressing the problems with education within the health system. I mean, look at girls' education. It's not just about putting money there. We understand that. I mean, there are chunks of, you look at the Sahel, there are chunks of girls there who are getting married by, you look at a country like Niger, the median age at marriage is 16. Sometimes we as statisticians or experts, we forget what that means. Median age actually means half of the girls have married by age 16. I mean, if you waste your, youth, your young population, in that way, there's nothing you can do to harness the demographic dividend. And these are structural issues that require top-level political leadership.
Right. So at the heart of this, we've talked about declines in family size and declines in fertility rate. And Hans Rosling, the wonderful Swedish professor that did that great chart, Trendalizer, talks about the future of countries resides in decisions that are made in the bedroom and in the bathroom. And so some of these issues are quite controversial. So Steve, let me turn to you. I know the Obama administration has really made women's health and focusing on reproductive health a centerpiece. How do you see the work of USAID contributing to some of the opportunities you've heard your colleagues talk about today in relation to the controversial nature of the key first driver of this equation?
Well, sure. I think it's a great question. I think it also relates in part to what you asked a second ago in terms of looking at country-level interventions and what role both the demographic dividend and that awareness can play towards policymakers and others. I mean, I really think there's sort of two things that both this work is both amplified by USAID and generally we ought to take into consideration. I think they're both political economy questions. I think, number one, you look at sort of decision making that takes place, across the spectrum, and I've seen it from a few different places. Capitol Hill is a good place where it's very short-term oriented. It's hard to actually build a rationale either for your constituents or for others to actually think through policies that at the moment seem to cost a lot of money, take a lot of political will to put in place, and may not actually be understood within an overall narrative of a country's development. Look at our own country, look at things like the Social Security Act, look at other changes in terms of creating IRAs and those types of things, those types of vehicles. How do you actually get policymakers within a given country to think and understand and put in place the governance reforms necessary so that you can have a demographic dividend that extends even beyond certain policies that will allow a productive working age population to lead to economic growth? How do you actually build that in over the longer term? How do you force a conversation beyond the immediate, beyond the next couple of years, the next few years, especially if you're a country that's struggling with a host of issues, emerging from conflict maybe, dealing with the transition in terms of industrialization? I think, having something like the demographic dividend can be a very powerful tool in a narrative to sell, I think, certain key policy changes that need to take place, but yet their immediate effect might not be felt. The other thing, too, related back to the question you asked a second ago, is trying to summon the political will to actually invest in, whether it's family planning, girls' education, or otherwise, and creating a strong understanding and imperative among a population to do such a thing. And again, there are always trade-offs when we look at what should be paid. There's and covered from ministers of finance to other budgetary outlays, and family planning can oftentimes get the short end of the stick when it comes to actually getting the sustained amount of investment that's needed. Having a narrative that says, look, there is an economic benefit that will accrue. We've seen it in East Asia. We've seen it in other regions. We're seeing it in certain places right now in South Asia, and we project that this will take place within sub-Saharan Africa. But these are the investments that are needed. This is the end result from a societal level, from a country level, that will end up taking place. That, to me, is a very powerful message, communications tool that policymakers can then use to put in place the right type of investments in these key areas to allow and harness this type of productive benefit.
No, that's great. So you all were talking about the fact that the new president of the World Bank, Dr. Kim, said yesterday by 2030, population will be, what was his goal?
3%.
3%, which is quite interesting. And you also talked about the President Obama's State of the Union address, which re-emphasized a commitment to really reducing poverty. So, Dr. Zulu, I know you've been looking at which countries might benefit from this and how far ahead they are, and how can you talk about the deep work you've been doing in countries in Africa in relation to that goal? Where do you see movement? Which countries might this work for and which others may not benefit?
Yeah, so when you look at Africa, actually looking at the demographic dividend issue, we have to recognize that Africa is not, just one sort of pocket. There are big differences, at regional level, but also within the regions, there are big country, differences. So you look at, if you start off from the regional level, you see that most progress has been made in Southern Africa, the countries at the southern tip of Africa, and North Africa. East Africa is coming up with the huge progress we are seeing in countries like Kenya, Rwanda, Ethiopia, and so on. But the areas where really not much is happening is Central Africa and West Africa. You look at and even when you look at West Africa, it's mostly the francophone parts of West Africa, where fertility hasn't declined that much. Girls' education is really at a very, very low level. So the sort of human capital investments, the demographic sort of investments, the public health investments are at a much, much lower level there. And so when you focus on those countries, you really have to start at a more basic level. I think if you start coming up and show the Thailand, Indonesia examples and so on, they haven't even done the most basic things that need to be done for development. And so for those countries, you might actually do much better if you focus on comparing more how they are behind compared to other African countries that they seem to be similar with in terms of context, culture, and so on. But when you start going now, you look at countries like South Africa, countries like Tunisia, Egypt, and so on. These are countries where fertility has gone down quite rapidly. But there were not similar sort of accompanying investments in the other sectors that were mentioned here. So Tunisia, actually, I was quite shocked when I looked at the Tunisia graph. When I was looking at this the first time, the pattern of fertility decline is very, very close to the East Asian countries. It was very, very rapid. You look at South Africa, it was a bit slower, but there's been that fertility decline. South Africa's total fertility rate now is 2.6. And actually, an official from South Africa at the meeting last week was dismissing this whole agenda and saying reducing fertility doesn't resolve anything. We have 26% unemployment with fertility rate of 2.6. But the point was trying to make, I chatted with him a little bit. I was like, maybe you need to be the one who need to come to this forum and say, you know, because we didn't make the other investments, look at us, look at where we are. So when you look at Tunisia, Tunisia is also maybe a case of a bus that has already left. You know, the fertility has gone down. They were not at the accompanying reforms, economic reforms that should have helped the country to move forward. And a lot of people have commented that part of the drivers of this Arab, you know, spring that we saw, is it 2 years ago, was this huge labor force. So if you don't make the appropriate investments, if you don't reform your economies, if you don't do the other investments we are talking about here, then the demographic, that labor surplus can actually, you know, result into what you might call a demographic curse, because you have insecurity, you have all these young people without jobs and so on. But for individual countries that are not doing well, I mean, you can look at countries, the Sahelian countries that I've talked about, even a country like Uganda, Malawi, very little decline in fertility is happening. But on the economic side, although Malawi had very, very high economic growth a few years ago, but it's still a very, very vulnerable country when you take into account climate change issues and so on, which a lot of the analysts on the demographic dividend don't even want to talk about the environment. But that's a very, very critical issue that we need to take into account, because when you look at the Sahel, you look at a lot of these other African countries, if you don't take into account the vulnerability to climate change, to environmental issues, you know, it's hard to see how you can address all the other issues. Other promising countries include Ethiopia. I mean, you look at Ethiopia, Kenya, Ghana, the countries in Southern Africa, as I said. But one critical thing we need to note about the countries that are doing well or that are most promising in Africa is that they actually have made very, very big investments in education. In all these countries, maybe with the exception of Ethiopia, the proportion of girls who are in secondary school, those of secondary school going age, are over 80%. In most of the countries that are not doing well, it's under 50% in Africa. So they have invested in girls' education. Child mortality has gone down quite considerably. These countries have also been, you know, politically stable for the most part, and there's strong political will to address issues to do with governance, to do with social services in general, which includes education, family planning, and public health in general.
Good, thank you. So, Steve, let me turn to you for a minute, and also you, Shanta. We're soon, at 2015, where we'll come to the end of the Millennium Development Goals target. And I think we've made huge progress in some areas. Poverty, we will meet the poverty target, although we know that in so many countries there's still so much poverty. This inspired a lot of really interesting conversation about how we can break down silos between people that are involved in health, people involved in national security, people involved in environment, food security. There's some cross-cutting issues. What is your thinking about how the demographic dividend frame can help us with these new conversations around the new development framework, the new development vision and paradigm? Sure. What's some of the conversations happening in your shops around that?
No, that's a great question, and you know, really, I think also just points to the broader issue that's been mentioned here, that sort of, I think demographics are a necessary but not sufficient condition when you look at what is you know, going to lead to economic growth in the long term. I mean, certainly, you know, when it comes to the post-2015 agenda, I think demographics have really risen to the forefront. I mean, there was a recent consultation that took place in Bangladesh and Dhaka that our ambassador attended. I think had very strong, high-level visibility. And I think the notion of having sort of a better cross-cutting understanding between different issues, and I think that demography really leads the pack in that end, but there's many other issues, looking at the sustainability agenda, for example, looking at environmental factors, climate change, and so on. That I think will inform our understanding about how to kind of move forward. I mean, I guess there is this dilemma when it comes to the Millennium Development Goals, and on sort of the one hand, I think people really look upon the way they focused on sort of single issues as as an important communications mechanism and as a motivating factor to actually galvanize responses towards issues that otherwise are either too complicated to understand to broader publics or just seem too difficult. And so when you have very clear-cut goals related around halving poverty, hunger, maternal health, mortality, education, and so on. They may be flawed goals. They may be incomplete. They may be goals that not every country will end up accomplishing. But they are a very easy frame and understandable way to bring together resources, to bring together advocacy, to bring together governments to actually do something fundamental. So the question, I think, as we're approaching the post-2015 agenda is let us, on the one hand, I think there's a greater amount of complexity that exists worldwide. There's a greater amount of diversity when it comes to different growth rates, when it comes to different responses. We know a lot more now than we did when the Millennium Declaration first came out in the 90s. Yet at the same time, we have to be careful not to lose the overall messaging and the galvanizing effect that we've been able to accomplish. And I think one reason that the extreme poverty agenda has been something that the President discussed in the State of the Union, that in the World Bank, the President yesterday reiterated, is that it does present a very clear frame in which to at least get at one critical issue that sort of extends beyond one country, one place, and so forth. Now the question is, can demography be a useful tool, I think, to understand some of the constraints, some of the factors that prevent countries from accomplishing the type of growth that's necessary to bring populations beyond the extreme growth, sort of extreme poverty area, and actually do something significant with that. And again, I think that's a tough issue, but hopefully it can be a useful tool and frame for advancing the agenda forward.
Good. Shanta, let me ask you, how do you think this conversation relates to the post-MDG discussion? And from your own perspective, what would you recommend?
Yeah, no, I think this is a very relevant conversation for the post-2015 agenda. First is
they're governed by instability or even broader ranges of conflict, places like the Congo, Somalia, South Sudan, other places that are really just on the sort of brink or in the throes of fragility. And that's where I think there are broader sort of political commitment, stability, institutional questions that play into things.
Yeah. Let me get back to demographic dividend a little bit. I think this is very thoughtful. Dr. Sulu, what do you think are the most important investments? And talk to us in particular about what are the things that need to happen in the very near term, like this next few years?
I think in the near term, there's need really to enhance investments in the public health arena, in schooling, in family planning. We already know that, over, is it what? I don't remember the number properly, but I think over, is it 80 million or 50 million of Africans have unmet need for family planning? A lot of economists, of course, fight that term that it doesn't really measure the demand and that sort of stuff. But I think that the fact is that there are these women who want to postpone the next birth, or they want to stop childbearing, and for whatever reasons, they are not using family planning. How can we convert? In many of these countries, actually, the proportion of women with unmet need for family planning is higher than the proportion who are using family planning. I think that if we enhance investments in this arena, not only by putting the family planning commodities on the table, but also addressing the psychosocial factors that prevent these women from using family planning even when they have access to them, that will help a lot. Because one critical thing we need to note about the demographic dividend is that, the rapidity of fertility decline is actually the most important factor in creating that big labor surplus. If fertility continues to decline at the rate that it's declining now, then it's not going to happen. Africa is not going to have that big, the size of the labor surplus is not going to be that big. And I think there are good reasons to actually be concerned about the way things are happening. Analysts have shown that if you compare East Asia and Africa, actually the fertility preferences, the demand for children is a lot higher in Africa than it was in East Asia at the time that fertility started declining. It might happen in Africa that fertility might stabilize around 3 as opposed to come back to 2. And stabilizing at 3, will not actually create that demographic dividend. So, and when you look at the countries I was mentioning, Middle Africa and West Africa, there's still some resistance there even among political leaders to look at this issue, with open minds. So the amount of work that needs to be done on the ground to mobilize resources to make sure that family planning is available, but also to address these other, non-supply or the demand side barriers of family planning are so huge that focusing on this issue while at the same time investing in female education will be one of the main areas, because by investing in female education, addressing family planning, it starts now giving you an opportunity to build that human capital that you can then use to create more jobs or to be more productive as you are reforming the economies.
Let me ask you a question. You're from Malawi yourself, and you live in Kenya now, is that right?
Yeah, I do.
Do you have hope about this, about the demographic dividend, the wheels turning like we saw the big? How are you feeling?
For Malawi or for Africa as a whole?
You can ask for both. Answer for both. Answer for both.
Actually, I'm very, very hopeful for Malawi. Malawi is one of those countries that has one of the highest contraceptive prevalence rates in Africa at 42% now. A country that banned family planning in 1969, only unbanned it in 1984. But during this short period, contraceptive use has increased so rapidly. But one of the main concerns that a lot of Malawians, including me, have is that we are increasing contraceptive use, but fertility is not declining that much. Malawi's fertility rate is still 5.7. Kenya, at the same level of contraceptive use, I'm pointing at my colleague from Kenya here. At the same level of contraceptive use, Kenya's fertility rate is 4.6. So there's an issue there. But I think what gives me hope, as far as Malawi is concerned, is that there's strong political leadership in Malawi to address this. The president, Joyce Banda, has made statements about this, and there's a huge campaign to try to understand why is it that our fertility is not going down after investing so much in family planning. I think one of the things has to be the issue of investing in women. One of the big differences between Malawi and Kenya is the level of women who are in secondary school, the investments that have been done in education. So part of my job is to talk to my president and others that family planning is not the only answer. You also have to develop the woman. You have to develop the social capital that the woman has. But I have hope that Africa is going to transform because there's convergence of political will. There are others who are not yet, on board yet, but by and large, having this resolution at the Ministers of Finance conference is a big deal. I think that getting it to the summit is going to be even a bigger deal, and that's going to happen from the way we are assessing things. So I'm hopeful because Africa is ready to move forward. People are realizing that you have to tackle all these issues, but also the international community, I think now, is coming to work with Africa from a sort of a different paradigm. Maybe it's not happening as much as it should, but we have to put the African experts, the African leaders there to own these problems and drive the process. If we want to follow the old way of doing things, it's not a fly-in, fly-out thing. We need to empower people on the ground to challenge our leaders there. And I think the conversations now are such that we are moving forward.
Yeah, wonderful, thank you. So on that point of hope, let's open it up to questions and answers. We have a microphone. This event is being live streamed, hello, to those who are watching us, and so I want to make sure that you wait for the microphone to get to you before you ask your question, and could you give your name and your organization? Does someone have the microphone? Okay, great. This woman right here, and then that person. Let's go ahead, and since I see so many, let's take 2 questions at a time. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, gentlemen. I appreciate your remarks, but I'm hearing a lot of
Can you tell us your name and
Oh,
your
I'm sorry.
organization?
Yes, of course. Paulette Lee, and I'm a communications consultant. I've worked in Ethiopia, Rwanda, and West Africa and Ghana. I'm hearing a perspective that is all top-down, or mostly, except for Dr. Zulu, who started talking a little bit about things that you referred to them as psychosocial factors. What kind of behavior changes are needed? And aside from the policy, at the policy level, the investment in certain sectors, what kind of behavior change is needed at the ground level? Thank you.
Okay, great, thank you. And then we'll take the second question and then, please, yes, tell us who you are. Oh, I think we can hear you. Yep, go ahead. Okay.
Thanks. I'm Ed Barry with the Sustainable World Initiative. I'd like to say from the front that we're totally supportive of girls' education and health, empowerment of women, family planning, et cetera, but to sit through a discussion about the demographic dividend without the subject of natural resources coming up is a little disturbing. You cite the case of Korea, Singapore, Thailand. Those are all societies that are dramatically overutilizing their resources compared to what they have. They're taking them to the world. And it just seems to us that if you really want to shift the demographic transition into a demographic dividend, you have to have jobs and a vibrant economy, but you need resources to support that. And maybe the truth is that we don't have those kinds of resources. So we would suggest that part of this discourse needs to include natural resource planning and investment interventions, but certainly at a minimum needs to be part of this conversation. So I would make that point, but also ask the question then, how would you suggest we connect this conversation with planetary limits?
Right, great,
Thanks.
great questions. Let me turn it to the panelists, and let me just say that the very seminal report from the UK Royal Society that Dr. Zulu was a part of, one of the main conclusions was that population and environment communities needed to start working together. So let me turn back to the group. We have a question about behavioral changes on the ground, and also the resource question as it relates to this. Would you like to begin?
Sure, happy to, although I'll let Dr. Zulu talk about his report more than I will. I will say, first, especially on the question, Ed, that you asked on environmental constraints, it's absolutely a part and needs to be a part of the conversation. I think about these issues from the policy office perspective from many different segments. One of the things that we're finishing up right now is looking at a global water development, water strategy when it comes to a number of different places, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. And the truth of the matter is, when it comes to water as one issue among several different resource flows, there won't be enough water to sustain either the type of industrialization we've seen in other places or the type of populations that potentially will come in the future without dramatically rethinking our approach to sustainability. So I think absolutely it needs to be part of the conversation. I think globally, we talked about the post-2015 agenda a second ago, and while demographics play into that together with other issues related to sustainability, stemming from the Rio Plus 20 discussions, looking at other environmental factors, looking at resource management when it comes to tropical forests, and so on and so forth. I think that's all part of an interlinked conversation that we have to pay attention to in a much more deliberate way.
Yeah, just one point about behavioral change. I think there are two sides to this. One is maybe we don't need behavioral change. We just need to change the incentives facing the actors in the system as they are. Right now, the quality of schooling is so bad that some people don't want to send their children to school. If we can change that, there's no behavioral change required. It's just that you improve the conditions under which families are able to send their children to school. That said, I think there are some deep behavioral issues, particularly having to do with relations between husbands and wives in the household. Exactly. I think that Dr. Zulu was referring to. So I think there are some, but I don't want to say that that's the only thing, because there are some changes that we can make just by improving access, improving quality of services, so that poor people can take advantage of it. On natural resources, it's interesting. When you started with that, I thought you were referring to something else, which is that right now there are many African countries that are abundant in natural resources, right, and oil-rich countries and so on. And what's really troubling is that they have some of the worst human development indicators. Let me give you an example. Gabon. Gabon is a country with a per capita income of $10,000. And that's not PPP. That's a regular GNP estimate. It has the lowest child immunization rate in Africa. It has a lower child immunization rate than Togo or Eritrea. Right? There's something going profoundly wrong with the way these countries are managing their natural resources. And I see a big agenda there if we want to get to some of these goals of poverty reduction in improving the governance of natural resources.
Please.
I think on the issue of environment, I should note that, as Peggy said, the report People and Planet came to the conclusion that there has to be two big changes. One, the excessively high levels of consumption in the developed world, including the US and all these countries. I mean, that's the main driver of global warming and so on. Unless there's political will and willingness to change that, we don't want to start talking like, oh, if these countries like Botswana develop and so on, they are now emitting, so much gases and so on, while there's nothing changing on the other side. So I think it's a bigger issue than that. But I think the critical point to note is that, we need to have the environment a component in the demographic dividend discussion. And so far, I've asked this question to some of the people working on this big World Bank study. When we met in Oslo, I asked them the question, how come you talk for 2 hours about this, the word there are two issues that they don't like mentioning. One is environment, and two is the issue about population numbers. So, sometimes we are made to think, when we talk about the demographic dividend, we should just be talking about the age structure changes. But this age structure change, when you look at countries in Africa, as that change happens, there's going to be a huge change in the population numbers as well. And one of the things we need to note is that if this change is slow in reducing fertility and mortality, the numbers are going to explode. And while maybe this may be too sensitive an issue for a lot of the people working on this, to me, I don't want to be boxed and say when I talk to the government of Malawi or government of Rwanda about population, all I should talk about is the issue about age structure changes. Because I think there are three critical elements about population. There's the urbanization issue, there's the population size issue, and there's the age structure change. And when the minister of, the former deputy prime minister of Thailand talked at the ministers' meeting last week, he actually said for Thailand, they made a decision at that point that they need to invest in managing their population, to make sure that people in rural areas have opportunities, they manage urbanization, they manage population growth. And the age structure issue anyway was not even an issue then, because they were just managing this and investing in development in general. And here's where they ended. So I think we should avoid trying to box ourselves or box our policy makers just because maybe the group of experts who have come with that issue, the demographic dividend, age structure changes, that's the only thing they want to focus on. I think it's about managing the population dynamics.
Good, great. Let's take some more questions. The woman in the back. Let's take a series of questions, the one in the red and the person in the gray and that one over there. Please tell us your name and organization and question.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Mason. I'm the health advisor for USAID's Middle East Bureau.
It may be that microphone doesn't work. Can everybody hear you? Hear her? No, try this one. I'm sorry, forgive me. Please.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Mason. I'm the health advisor for USAID's Middle East Bureau. So this conversation is very interesting to me. I actually have two questions. The first one is, when Dr. Zulu mentioned that perhaps the bus has already left the station for some countries, I'm wondering if there's a second chance to catch that bus, or are there things you can do to maybe take advantage to some extent of this? If you've lowered your fertility, your education rates are high, et cetera, are there things that still can be maybe half of a demographic dividend or some benefits of it? And my second question is also, Dr. Zulu, it seemed like you were referring that a TFR of 3 may be too high for achieving a demographic dividend. Is there a magic number, a magic TFR number that we should be looking towards for the population or the fertility side of this?
Great questions. The woman in the gray, please tell us your name and organization and your question.
Hi, thank you. My name is Nancy Termini. I'm with the Population Council, and my question is for all three panelists, and also pertains to this concept of catching the bus, and balancing the catching of the bus and the demographic dividend with kind of longer-term planning. How do you kind of simultaneously invest in catching this demographic dividend while also planning for 30 years later once that bulge has become a part of the aging population and you have a smaller labor force, kind of recognizing that you have to do step one before step two. But at what point do you start laying the groundwork for that once you've gotten on the road to the demographic dividend?
Great,
Thank
great
you.
question, thank you. And this woman right here, and I think this is the one that's working that microphone.
Thanks. Carolyn Lemire from the Environmental Change and Security Program at the Wilson Center. And I realize that the demographic dividend is a really difficult topic to discuss and bring up with policymakers. I was wondering if you could talk about if you've had a harder time discussing the investments with policymakers, people who hope to reap the demographic dividend without doing the investments in education and those sorts of things that are really necessary, or if you've had a harder time talking about population and reproductive health with other policymakers who maybe don't want to discuss those sorts of issues.
Great, great. Excellent questions. Those are great. Let me just turn it back to the group. Anyone want to jump in on any one of those excellent questions?
Okay.
Go ahead.
Elliot wanted me to take the question about catching the second bus or the
Is there
second
a
chance,
second bus, right?
the second chance at the bus. No, because I think it's sort of what we all three have been saying so far, which is the bus never really is inaccessible, because there are lots of things you can do even if the fertility rate remains high. I mean, frequently we've observed, actually in Kenya as well, that the fertility rate fell and then plateaued for a while. And now, but there are things during that plateau phase that you can do that will help contribute to bringing it down further, like the things we've been talking about, the bringing down child mortality through water sanitation, girls' education, and so on. Those are still good, worthwhile things to do, and they might deliver on the demographic dividend. Just remember, I mean, 30 years ago, people had written off Bangladesh. Mm-hmm. Today, the fertility rate is below 3, I think, right? 2 point something. 2.3, yeah. So, I don't think you've ever missed the bus. I think there's plenty to be done there. I like this question about preparing for the aging population. I think this is extraordinarily important in Africa, because that's the other opportunity we have. Right now, we can avoid some of the problems that the higher income and the middle income regions are having, which is they've got this aging population without the pension systems and other systems to accommodate them. The time to plan for that is when you have a young population, which is now. So I think this is exactly the right point.
Right.
I would just, add a couple things. I think, when it comes, especially, you look at context in a region like the Middle East, I think, there's policy lag that can be difficult to overcome. I think it seems that that's one of the bigger issues. So if you already have a large working age population that's in the prime of actually contributing productively to an economy. The necessary changes that one needs to put in place, first of all, take a while, and second of all, take an even longer period to actually take effect, across a range of issues. And, I think if you haven't laid the groundwork and prepare for that, I think it can be more difficult. It's a funny issue. I think it was actually something that a few of us have been sort of batting around as a research question in terms of better understanding what type of specific interventions within certain population structures can have a more immediate impact versus less so. And I think the Middle East being a very critical context in terms of our own foreign policy interests there. And I don't think we have a clear understanding. What we do know is that if you start early, as my panelists have mentioned, if you plan in advance, if you are able to anticipate population structures and begin to put in place the right type of policies, and I think that also extends, Nancy, to your question about sort of planning for a second age, older age populations as well. I think you're in a much better place, which all really sort of I think emphasizes that there is a lot of potential when it comes to countries in sub-Saharan Africa. In terms of really harnessing and being able to take advantage of this. But, for other regions, I think the evidence is mixed so far. Yeah.
Elliot. Great questions.
Yeah,
for you.
so I think the issue about the bus, just to add to what my colleagues have said, yeah, the critical thing is long-term planning. And it's very, very important that for the demographic dividend agenda in Africa now, it gets away from that high level to go to the country level, to start doing country level analysis, to look at these age structures, look at the economic issues at country level, because that's where the action is going to happen. So once you start doing that and start showing if, you know, this is the policy scenario you follow, or this pattern of fertility decline and so on, this is where you might be 20, 30 years from now. Countries need to start investing ahead of time. Because you might wake up like, you know, Tunisia, where you see this huge labor surplus that, you know, you haven't prepared for if you don't prepare ahead of time. But as we have emphasized, you know, throughout the discussion today, the demographic dividend is not the only, you know, way you can develop. A lot of countries whose fertility declined at a very, very slow pace and over a long period of time, they never had that huge labor surplus coming in, you know, within a short period of time, but they still develop. So countries like Tunisia, it's not like they can't develop, but I think the point is that that window of opportunity of taking advantage of this big labor surplus is not as big, or if they don't make those investments now urgently, then they will never take advantage of that. But that doesn't mean that you can't develop without really following that route. I think there was a question about behavior changes at grassroots level. I can tell you that I think for the most part, if you look at African countries, the African women, the African men are, you know, ahead of a lot of the policymakers. When you go to the meeting like where I was last week, some of the ministers were saying things like, oh, it's not cultural for us to be talking about family planning. Or, you know, let's be sensitive to the fact that Africa is different from those other countries. Yes, Africa is different. But I think sometimes policymakers can be gatekeepers, and they have their views about what it means to be African. I think the voice you need to pay attention to is that a lot of women out there are in need of family planning. They don't want to have as many children as they are having. They want to have fewer children than the generation of their mothers and grandmothers. So the issue we need to look at is how do we facilitate them? How do we empower them to make sure that they get this done? And I think in any country where there's been strong political will to address these issues, women have followed, and women also learn from each other. They see this woman who is using family planning, she looks healthier, her children look healthier, they copy from each other. So behavior change is something that will more or less happen automatically when the political will is there, I think. And finally, I think your point about, you know, if demographic dividend is a complex term, I think it relates to the point I made earlier, that we shouldn't box ourselves into philosophies and go with one. Because if you go to a country like Rwanda, the reason why Rwanda prioritized family planning and population issues, I mean, the issue about the demographic dividend wasn't even that critical. Rwanda is a very, very densely populated country. They were concerned about population growth. So Rwanda, you can go and talk about population numbers. But if you go to Uganda, President Museveni doesn't want to hear anything about numbers. So the demographic dividend becomes an enticing concept. And also the fact that investing in family planning helps improve women and children's health is very, very critical. So we should assess the local context, see who are the key policymakers there, what are their issues, what are their concerns, and go with appropriate messages that will let them take the appropriate action.
There's also the question about what is the magic number? Is it 2.6?
Oh,
is it
right.
3?
Yeah.
Can you speak to that one? The magic
So
number.
I don't know the magic number, but I think what I know is that if your fertility stabilizes at 3, it doesn't go more or less to replacement level fertility. You are not going to get that big, you know, labor surplus, because even at 3, the sort of child dependency ratio, I don't have the exact number here, the child dependency ratio will remain high. At 3, it means your population is still growing. I mean, you are better off than fertility at 5 and so on. But a lot of these countries that actually experience the demographic dividend, their fertility is at 2 or below. And if you don't get that level, it means that the size of the labor surplus is not going to be as big, and your population will continue growing, you know, for much, much longer. So there's that we need to take into account. So I don't have the magic number to say you have to reach 1.5 or 1.8, maybe our colleagues here, I don't know, or somebody in the audience.
Someone in the audience.
Yeah.
So we're coming up to our end point. I want to take the prerogative of the moderator's chair to say, okay, so last week, or just early this month, both President Obama and Jim Kim of the World Bank said, we're really going to move the needle on poverty. This is the most urgent issue, also reflecting climate change and other things. Okay, imagine they heard about this dividend conversation. Over at Aspen, these guys were having this great conversation about it. Presume you have just sort of a minute or two to talk to. Jim Kim and Obama are sitting there together saying, what would you advise us? We want to work together on this. What would you advise us? Start with you. What would you tell them to do?
So I'll just tell them that, you know, there's this nice concept called the demographic dividend. That is not controversial in many people's minds, because it really looks at how you optimize your population characteristics for the country's development if you take specific population policies. So let's invest in people, let's invest in public health, let's empower women to have the number of children that they want to have. And we know that if you do that, the number of children will be, fertility will go down because women want to have fewer children anyway. So we invest in women, we invest in family planning to empower them to actually manage their fertility. And on top of that, we need to invest in education and reform our policies so that we can create enough jobs and attract investments and savings for the future.
Great, great. I think they would love that. Okay, let's go have a beer. Tell us more about that. What would you say, Jim, Dr. Kim?
I think I have said this to Dr. Kim. The demographic.
But you got both of them now.
Yeah. The demographic dividend in Africa, if you take advantage of it, it's the best opportunity we've ever had to reach that goal of 3% poverty by 2030.
Okay. Good. Wonderful. He'd ask you for the beer too. What would you cover?
The elevator pitch. I think this would be, I would say, thinking both presidents, this is a chance to change the conversation. There's talk about one or both of them paying a visit to Africa this summer. I'm thinking about our president in particular. When there is a discussion and they're able to speak to policymakers there, and the question comes to, how can we support and work together towards the extreme poverty goal? I hope that demographic dividend is one tool an approach that's mentioned as a way to get at multiple factors that affect poverty across the board, from beginning to end, from the economic growth factor to family planning and child mortality interventions, all the way down to older age populations and understanding that spectrum. And if that's one aspect and concept that can be discussed in a serious way, I think we can make progress.
Oh, great, excellent, wonderful. Let me just say thank you to this wonderful group of panelists. Really great. I think we're all really grateful that you all are thinking in a really big and creative way about these issues, especially given the depth of experience all of you bring to this issue. I really want to thank all of you for joining us. I particularly want to thank the small but mighty Aspen Global Health and Development and Aspen team, Gwen Hopkins, Elise Mann, Rachel Feely-Cole, Jean is there. They are incredible. And the Aspen team who's been filming this and live streaming us. Also, I see Laura back there. Forgive me for forgetting you. They've worked hard to make this a really wonderful event for you. So we're delighted you've all come. Please enjoy yourself outside in the refreshments if you'd like, and feel free to approach the panelists to talk afterwards. But thank you so much.
Thank you.
You're really great. You guys were great.
That was good. Great questions.
I think it was really